everybody, and welcome to this ASMR history video. Yes, we're finally back with another one of these on the channel, probably what we do best and what are most popular here. We are back with one, and it is one that was requested by one of you guys, so I do read the comments obviously because I don't get that many being a small creator. But it is of course the American Revolution. If I can find the comment, it will pop up here. But yeah, I've got some new lighting, and I went for like a blue because apparently, according to science, blue is the most relaxing colour. But you'll have to let me know that in the comments. But yeah, we'll change the colours up as we go throughout the videos for the foreseeable future. And I just thought, yeah, it was a nice background, and it mixes it up a little bit. But yes, onto the history now. How we usually do these videos is just like a simple breakdown of the key events bar the Vietnam War one, but I have a great deal more knowledge in that area of history. But we're going to be mixing it up a bit today, and well, it's probably how these history videos are going to be structured in the future. There was a comment on a previous history video that said, I get multiple comments saying this helps people revise, just brush up on facts, etc, etc, etc. So there's going to be 3 sections to this video. The first section is just going to be a quick little introduction / overview of what the American Revolution is. 2, like the usual history videos, we're going to go through the key dates, the key events, a timeline if you will, and then number 3, we're going to look at like one specific aspect, and this like specific element we're going to look at is taken from an A-level exam paper. Yes, I did in fact Google some exam questions, and obviously I'm not going to, be going through the whole AQA mark scheme, but basically I found like a question / subject, and then we're going to break down just like the basic points and answers, if you will, to said subject / question. So I hope that makes sense. So enough rambling, enough waffling. Without further ado, let's get into the history of the American Revolution. So we begin with an overview. The American Revolution, also called United States War of Independence or American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 83. Insurrection was an insurrection by which 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies won political independence and went on to form the United States of America. The war followed more than a decade of growing estrangement between the British Crown and a large and influential segment of its North American colonies that was caused by British attempts to assert greater control over colonial affairs, after having long adhered to a policy of salutary neglect. Until early in 1778, the conflict was a civil war within the British Empire, but afterward it became an international war as France and Spain, in 1778 and 79 respectively, joined the colonies against Britain. Meanwhile, the Netherlands, which provided both official recognition of the United States and financial support for it, was engaged in its own war against Britain. From the beginning, sea power was vital in determining the course of the war, lending to British strategy a flexibility that helped compensate for the comparatively small numbers of troops sent to America, and ultimately enabling the French to help bring about the final British surrender at Yorktown. Some of those sentences were crazy long, so yeah, that just gives you an introduction, a sort of sense of what the American Revolution was, because while a lot of you may be using this to brush up on, your knowledge and dates and stuff, many of you may know absolutely nothing about the American Revolution, so that is, there's your introduction. So now let's get into the key events and timeline. So the timeline I have here begins in 1754. 1754 to 1763 we have the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris ended the French French and Indian War, the American phase of a worldwide 9 years war fought between France and Great Britain. The European phase was the 7 Years' War. As a result of this war, France ceded all of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The costs of the war contributed to the British government's decision to impose new taxes on its American colonies. On March 22nd, 1765, we have the Stamp Act. Like the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act was imposed to provide increased revenues to meet the costs of defending the enlarged British Empire. It was the first British parliamentary attempt to raise revenue through direct taxation on a wide variety of colonial transactions, including legal writs, newspaper advertisements, and ships' bills of lading. Enraged colonists nullified the Stamp Act through outright refusal to use the stamps, as well as by riots, stamp burning, and intimidation of colonial stamp distributors. June 15th to July 2nd, 1767, we have the Townshend Acts. A series of 4 acts, the Townshend Acts, were passed by the British Parliament in an attempt to assert what it considered to be its historic right to exert authority over the colonies through suspension of a recalcitrant representative assembly and through strict provisions for the collection of revenue duties. The acts were resisted everywhere with verbal agitation and physical violence, deliberate evasion of duties, renewed non-importation agreements among merchants, and overt acts of hostility towards British enforcement agents, especially in Boston. In response, in October 1768, Parliament dispatched 2 regiments of the British Army to go to Boston. On the 5th of March 1770, the Boston Massacre. In Boston, a small British Army detachment that was threatened by mob harassment opened fire and killed 5 people, an incident soon known as the Boston Massacre. The soldiers were charged with murder and were given a civilian trial, in which John Adams conducted a successful defence. 16th of December 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party, protesting both attacks on tea and the perceived monopoly of the East India Company. A party of Bostonians thinly disguised as Mohawk people boarded ships at anchor and dumped some £10,000 worth of tea into the harbour, an event popularly known as the Boston Tea Party. From March to June 1774, we have intolerable acts. A lot of these words are tongue twisters. In retaliation for colonial resistance to British rule during the winter of 1773 to 74, the British Parliament enacted 4 measures that became known as the Intolerable Acts: the Boston Port Act, Massachusetts Government Act, Administration of Justice Act, and Quartering Act. Rather than intimidating Massachusetts and isolating it from the other colonies, the oppressive acts became the justification for convening the First Continental Congress later in 1774. Leading into that, September 5th, 1774 is the First Continental Congress convening, called by the Committees of Correspondence in response to the Intolerable Acts. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. 56 delegates represented all the colonies except Georgia. On the 23rd of March 1775, Patrick Henry gave his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Convinced that war with Great Britain was inevitable, Virginian Patrick Henry defended strong resolutions for equipping the Virginia militia to fight against the British in a fiery speech in a Richmond church with the famous words, "I know not what courses others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." April 18th, Year's Ride and the battles of Lexington and Concord. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Paul Revere rode from Charleston to Lexington to warn that the British were marching from Boston to seize the colonial armory at Concord. En route, the British force of 700 men was met on Lexington Green by 77 local Minutemen and others. It is unclear who fired the first shot, but it sparked a skirmish that left 8 Americans dead. At Concord, the British were met by hundreds of militiamen. Outnumbered and running low on ammunition, the British column was forced to retire to Boston. On the returning march, American snipers took a deadly toll on the British. Total losses in the battles of Lexington and Concord numbered 273 British and more than 90 Americans. The 17th of June 1775 brings the Battle of Bunker Hill. Breed's Hill in Charlestown was the primary locus of combat in the misleadingly named Battle of Bunker Hill, which was part of the American siege of British-held Boston. Some 2,300 British troops eventually cleared the hill of the entrenched Americans, but at the cost of more than 40% of the assault force. The battle was a moral victory for the Americans. January 1776, Thomas Paine's Common Sense is published. In late 1775, the colonial conflict with the British still looked like a civil war, not a war aiming to separate nations. However, the publication of Thomas Paine's irreverent pamphlet, Common Sense, abruptly put independence on the agenda. Paine's 50-page pamphlet, couched in elegant direct language, sold more than 100,000 copies within a few months. More than any other single publication, Common Sense paved the way for the Declaration of Independence. On the 4th of July 1776, the Declaration of Independence is adopted. After the Congress recommended that colonies form their own governments, the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson and revised in committee. On July 2nd, the Congress voted for independence, and on July 4th it adopted the Declaration of Independence. 22nd of September 1776, Nathan Hale is executed. On September 21st, 1776, having penetrated the British lines on Long Island to obtain information, American Captain Nathan Hale was captured by the British. He was hanged without trial the next day. Before his death, Hale is thought to have said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," a remark similar to one in the play Cato by Joseph Addison. December 25th to 26th, 1776, Washington crosses the Delaware. Having been forced to abandon New York City and driven across New Jersey by the British, George Washington and the Continental Army struck back on Christmas night by stealthily crossing the ice-strewn Delaware River, surprising the Hessian garrison at Trenton at dawn, and taking some 900 prisoners. The American triumph at Trenton and in the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, roused the new country and kept the struggle for independence alive. October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne surrenders at Saratoga. Moving south from Canada in summer 1777, a British force under General John Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga, who knows, on July 5th, before losing decisively at Bennington, Vermont, on August 16th, and Bemis Heights, New York, October 7th. His forces depleted, Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. December 19th, 1777 to June 19th, 1778, Washington winters at Valley Forge. Following failures at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, Washington and 11,000 regulars took up winter quarters at Valley Forge, 22 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. its ranks were decimated by rampant disease, semi-starvation and bitter cold. The reorganised Continental Army emerged the following June as a well-disciplined and efficient fighting force. February 6th, 1778, France and the United States form an alliance. The French had secretly furnished financial and material aid to the Americans since 1776, but with the signing in Paris of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance, the Franco-American alliance was formalised. France began preparing fleets and armies to enter the fight, but did not formally declare war on Britain until June 1778. On September 23rd, 1779, John Bull Jones states, "I have not yet begun to fight." The US battleship, the Bonhomme Richard, was getting the worst of its battle with the British vessel HMS Cerberus off Flamborough Head, England, when the American commander John Bull Jones refused to surrender, proclaiming, "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones ultimately triumphed, but he lost his ship in the process. September 1780, Benedict Arnold turns traitor. Having fought valiantly in a number of battles earlier in the war, American General Benedict Arnold conspired with the British to surrender the fort at West Point, New York, that he commanded. When John Andre, the British Army officer with whom Arnold had negotiated, was hanged as a spy after he was captured and the plot revealed, Arnold took sanctuary with the British. March 1st, 1781, Articles of Confederation ratified. The Articles of Confederation, a plan of government organisation that served as a bridge between the initial government by the Continental Congress and the federal government provided under the US Constitution of 1787, were written in 76 to 77 and adopted by the Congress on November 15th, 1777. However, the Articles were not fully ratified by the states until March 1st, 1781. In September to October 1781, we have the Siege of Yorktown. After winning a costly victory at Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, on March 15th, 1781, Lord Cornwallis entered Virginia to join other British forces there, setting up a base at Yorktown. Washington's army and a force under the French Count de Rochambeau placed Yorktown under siege, and Cornwallis surrendered his army of more than 7,000 men on October 19th, 1781. And finally, on the 3rd of September 1783, the Treaty of Paris ends the war. After the British defeat at Yorktown, the land battles in America largely died out, but the fighting continued at sea, chiefly between the British and America's European allies, which came to include Spain and the Netherlands. The military verdict in North America was reflected in the preliminary Anglo-American Peace Treaty of 1782, which included in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. By its terms, Britain recognised the independence of the United States with generous boundaries, including the Mississippi River on the west. Britain retained Canada, but ceded East and West Florida to Spain. And that draws to a close the timeline portion of this video. Obviously, there are many more complexities and slightly smaller scale events that would have definitely influenced the course of the American Revolutionary War, but they were just like some of the key main events to give you like a really good sense of the course of history for Americans' road to independence. So, as I mentioned, we're now going to take a little look at like a specific aspect that I robbed from an A-level exam paper, and basically what we could like title this sort of question what was the main reason for American victory? So basically, I'm not going to tell you how to answer your exam question or whatever, but even if this isn't for like revision, this is still interesting. I'm basically just going to break down in bullet points and short explanations the key factors that influenced America's success in this war. So, one reason that they won it was their alliance with France. Arguably the single most important of Benjamin Franklin's many contributions to his nation was securing a French alliance during the Revolution. Without the financial and military assistance provided by France, the colonists would certainly have fared much worse against the mighty British Empire. The next factor is British debt. Ironically, this was one of the key factors that caused the revolution in the first place. Britain had acquired a massive debt fighting the French and Indian War. It attempted to pay down that debt by taxing colonists through the Stamp Act, generating far more resentment than revenue. When hostilities first erupted, the Crown did not anticipate that the war would drag on as long as it did, nor cost them so much. The ever-growing expenses of the war piled on top of an already enormous mountain of debt that Britain could no longer afford. Next factor, distance. At the time of the Revolution, there was no internet, no telephone, not even a telegraph. State the obvious, sending even a simple message from England to North America took several weeks at a minimum. Transporting troops, munitions, and supplies presented even more difficulties. Washington, his officers, troop supplies, and reinforcements were all within a few days' travel from one another. King George was on the other side of the world. Familiarity with the territory. Many of the British soldiers had never set foot in North America prior to fighting war there. The colonists were fighting in their own backyards, while British officers were well trained and often had plenty of direct battlefield experience. That experience was primarily acquired in the fields of Europe. Military tactics that were effective in that environment were disastrous in America. Some military historians place particular emphasis on the colonists' use of guerrilla warfare, with individuals and small squads initiating hit and run attacks on the enemy, instead of marching out in huge, orderly, easily targetable columns like good European gentlemen. To what degree this specific tactical shortcoming contributed to British defeat is a matter of debate, but the colonists' familiarity with the territory and adoption of tactics appropriate to that territory was certainly a significant factor. Like reading that there's such a massive similarity between this and the Vietnam War, except with the Vietnam War the shoe is on the other foot. The Americans in this case are using their environment and surroundings to their advantage, which contributed to beating their enemy, and that's exactly what the Vietnamese would do a couple hundred years later, so that's pretty crazy. And the final factor I have down here is hearts and minds. In some sense, the Americans had already won the public relations war before a single shot was even fired. Many intellectuals throughout Europe, including England, felt that the colonists' rebellion was the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals, and while it's a misconception that the colonists were united in a spirit of revolutionary fervour, British public support for the war was even more tepid. They were already deep in debt and digging deeper, fighting on the other side of the globe against an opponent with powerful allies and which many within their own country believed was in the right. After Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown, Britain's military was not crushed. It could have continued fighting, but it was simply not worth it. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this ASMR history video. I hope you did find it both informative and relaxing, as that is the kind of aim of these videos. Do comment down below what time periods, events you'd like to see covered in future. If you did enjoy this video, please do leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and until the next video, everybody,